Benefit after Nottingham, and worked in Asia and Africa. And then you became a deputy, eventually in your long career, you became deputy manager for UK government's Plant Sciences Research Program based in Bangor University. Bangor University is in Wales. And he, in his own career, although he's not said much, is that Dave has worked towards making sure that he realized before people started talking about it that if you want to increase productivity, you have to have good establishment. So he worked a lot on the farming and the like. And he joined us about 2 years ago in the research. But for scientists, or budding scientists, we are lucky to have Dave here for one thing. He's the chief editor of Experimental Agriculture. So if you're publishing, thinking of publishing in Experimental Agriculture is nice to drop it to him so that he sees it where it's fit to put it and so on. The topic of his presentation today is well written, but one thing that interested me most and I laughed about it is that he said intensificationability, which is basically a copyright. So you have got to acknowledge Phil Dovey, who is also on campus, if you're trying to write that word. So there you are. Welcome.
Thank you. Oh, lots, but we'll argue about it later.
Okay, thanks. You know, his presentation is actually, we've talked about it, is about intensification and whether our ability to do that, work on it is really worth it. So they're welcome.
Thank you, Saeed. And thank you all for coming. You're actually quite a select group. So, intensificationability. This is a word that was coined by our colleague Phil Dovey after he'd seen some of the data that I'm going to show you here. And it's basically a measure of whether or not rural households can intensify their agricultural enterprises, and if they can intensify them, what is the impact on their livelihoods of that intensification. And as the subtitle shows, we're going to look at it from a smallholder household perspective, and we're going to look at it through the lens of profitability. So, briefly, this is the outline of the presentation. We're going to talk briefly about what sustainable intensification is. We're going to look at the difference between productivity and profitability. Then we're going to get into a bit more detail about the relationship between profitability, land holding, and household per capita income. And then we're going to look at the evidence for the range of profitability in relation to improved technologies. And then finally, we're going to get on to the key issue of intensificationability. So, have I missed one? This isn't working. Okay, so sustainable intensification. There's a general consensus amongst researchers for development and development planners that this is the way forward for rural households to reduce poverty and improve food security. But from my point of view, I don't think sustainable intensification has been rigorously defined properly yet, and certainly its potential and limits haven't been quantified. So hopefully we can make some contributions today. We all have an implicit understanding of what sustainable intensification is. We believe that it entails some sort of increase in agricultural production while minimising or reversing damage to the environment. There's a fairly standard definition. This comes from the big USAID Feed the Future program, which is kicking off this year. But we need to ask: is this the way things can be, or is this the way things ought to be? Is this wishful thinking? So I'm asking some questions. And I'm going to ignore sustainability in this presentation, because that's a whole other presentation. We're just going to talk about intensification, ignoring the sustainability for the moment. Can rural households intensify their agricultural enterprises? If they can, are there limits to how much they can intensify? And if they do so, what are the impacts? So, productivity versus profitability. As researchers, we generally, most of us, concentrate on increasing production, increasing productivity, moving maize yields from 2 tons per hectare to 3 tons per hectare, and we develop technology and management systems and cropping systems that can do these things, can improve productivity. I'll use the thing. Increasing yields is relatively easy. All you have to do is throw money at the problem. Increased yields generally incur increased costs. And it's the net return, which I'm defining here as the profitability from farmer investments of cash, labour, time, etc., that are really important to farming households. And I would suggest that it's the net return on investment that influences adoption decisions. And it's also implicit in the concept of intensification that rural households have to generate income, which is then partially or fully reinvested in agricultural enterprises. So this emphasises the importance of net returns, income from agriculture. So, net returns, and in this presentation, what I mean by net returns include monetized benefits such as the market value of food consumed directly. Net returns are usually expressed on a per hectare basis. They can be expressed on other bases, but for our purposes, they're generally expressed on a per hectare basis. But household well-being, poverty levels are usually expressed as, for instance, $1 per person per day, a widely used, perhaps less widely used these days, measure of profitability. There are other poverty thresholds. A commonly used one these days is $1.25 a day. Some agencies actually use $2 per person per day. But for the purposes of this presentation, I use $1 a day because it's widely known, and it's the most easily achievable. Now, there's a relationship between the amount of land required for any household to achieve a given income threshold. It depends on the profitability of any cropping enterprise and the number of people in the household. And the relationship is that. It's very simple, and it's also a completely closed relationship. If you define the variables as they are here, there are no external factors affecting that relationship. And this is what it looks like when plotted out. A couple of things to note, that the land per household, in hectares, required to give $1 per person per day, decreases as profitability increases as the number of people in the household. increases. Okay? Quite simple. And there's nothing else that affects that relationship. I might note that this relation holds for any crop, any combination of crops, or even any land-based enterprise. If you build a hotel on a piece of land, if the net returns are $400 per hectare, you need that amount of land. But obviously for a hotel, we'd be operating over here somewhere. So what are typical values or values for net returns from rain-fed crop production, i.e. how long in that previous graph is the axis? Well, did a literature survey, and these are the criteria for inclusion in the analysis. Since 2000, rain-fed cropping only. Any reports or papers had to have net returns, which are defined here as benefits minus variable costs, but including labour and including family labour. And they had to have a comparison of a control or a base case or a farmer's practice with an improved technology. I found 69 cases, and I've since found some more, but we'll stick with the original 69. They include a wide range of crops from annual cereals, annual legumes, through to more, where are we? Formatting's gone a bit strange there. But higher value crops like cocoa, coffee, etc., etc. A whole range of technologies, and from the reports from a whole range of countries. And when they're plotted out in paired comparisons, they look like that. This is plotted, ranked by the increasing improved technology. As you can see, there are some big differences between pairs. They are somewhat self-selecting because they're from the literature, and improved technologies that don't work don't get published. But improved technologies in various circumstances do seem to work, but there is a relatively restricted range, and there seems to be some sort of limit around about $700 per hectare per season. And to summarize that graph, the median value of those 69 cases for the base case, which we can take as the unimproved situation, is $84 per hectare per season. Only $84 per hectare per season. The median value for the improved cases is $268 per hectare per season. Now, we as technology providers, technology producers, can pat ourselves on the back and say, well, on average, we, with technology, can improve profitability by 220%. That's excellent. That's very, very good. The median value for the benefit cost ratio for the improved technology is 2.1. A BC ratio of anything greater than 1 is profitable. As a general rule of thumb, a BC ratio of 2 is attractive to farmers. So again, these technologies are effective in increasing profitability. But the range of net returns is narrow, up to about $700 per hectare per season. And returns around $700 per hectare per season are quite rare. So we get on to intensification ability now. I've given this presentation before, and what I'm talking about here is the elephant in the room. Now, in previous presentations, people don't all understand what I mean by the elephant in the room, so I'm going to say what I mean by it. It's an issue that's so huge that people try and, they don't try, they sort of automatically ignore it, even though it is huge. And the elephant in the room, in this case, is this. Although we don't have very good data on the distribution of farm size in the smallholder context, in the developing country context. A good estimate of the distribution of farm size is this, and it says 80% of farms in sub-Saharan Africa are now below 2 hectares. And that was in 2005, and I suspect that the situation has only got worse. Here are some of the consequences of this issue of farm size. This is using data from some farm surveys from Malawi, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Mali. In relation to this value of $268 per hectare per year, which is the median, if you recall, is the median value for improved technologies. In Malawi, where the average farm size is just about a hectare, and the household size average is about 4.8 people per household. Remember, a hectare per household at the moment. To get $1 a day, they need about 7 hectares per household. So there's a huge shortfall. In Ethiopia, bigger households, 6.4 per household, bigger farms, 2.4 hectares. But they need about 10 to get not to make a massive amount of money, just to get to $1 per person per day. In Nigeria, West Africa, where the trend is for large households and larger farms, at the moment, the average farm size is 8.4 hectares, and even with improved technology, they need about 14 hectares. So there's a shortfall there. Mali, even more extreme, 20 people per household, 13 hectares, they require about 30 just to get $1 per person per day. So, a sort of a hypothesis. Whether or not you can benefit significantly from intensification depends on 2 things. It depends on where you are, which determines what crops you can grow, how many cropping seasons per year, and what inputs you can access, and how much they cost, obviously, and also what prices you can get for them. It depends on where you are and what you have. Land, household size, and labour. So, to check on this hypothesis, I've been looking for baseline surveys, and I've found about 20 so far. And in this analysis, there are 8 from a project called Kalesa, which I'm the principal investigator on, 4 from Zimbabwe, 4 from Kenya. The CCAF's CRP7 climate change program, I've taken 4 of their baseline studies, and the N2 Africa project, which is ongoing, I've taken 8 of their baseline studies, so 20 altogether. They're quite detailed household surveys, but all I've used for this analysis is household size, farm size, and the number of seasons per year, cropping seasons per year. And all I've done is take the individual household data and calculate for any given value of net return the percentage of that community that's $1 per person per day. And this is what it looks like. There are only 12 plotted here, because if you put all 20 on it, it looks very crowded. But the other 8 all fall within here somewhere. And as you can see, the very best of them, which is Makueni in Kenya, at the limit of dollars per hectare per season, you can only get 70% of the households just to $1 a day. Down here, the worst case is, where are we? Mutopos, which is in Zimbabwe. Even getting $700 per hectare per season, you can only get 10%. of these households to $1 a day. The other 90%, no. To simplify things a bit, I've taken out 4 of those lines, 4 of those sites, because they can be used to illustrate some interesting comparisons. Makueni and Limuru are both in Kenya. They have similar rainfall. Limuru has a bit more. They both have 2 cropping seasons a year. They differ mainly in the average farm size. In Makueni, big farms. In Limuru, small farms. As you can see, 99% of the farmers in Limuru have less than 2 hectares, whereas only 40% in Makueni have less than 2 hectares. In Matopos and Kaffrine, which is in Senegal, both of these have only 1 season a year, very similar rainfall, huge difference in farm size, 81% with less than 2 hectares, nobody has less than 2 hectares in Senegal, with a huge difference in the mean farm size. So if you plot just those 4 sites, you can see that, again, Makueni responds best to an increase in net return, which is essentially, an increase in net return is essentially agricultural intensification. So Makueni responds best, the slope is highest, and that is essentially because it has 2 seasons a year, and the farmers have reasonable farm sizes of about 3.5 hectares. In comparison with Limuru, which is this blue one here, where although the rainfall's similar and it has 2 seasons a year, for any given net return, the response to intensification is very, very flat, simply because farmers only have half a hectare. And with such a small farm size, even with 2 seasons a year, it doesn't make much difference. The difference between Kaffrine in Senegal here and Matopos, which is the red line in Zimbabwe, again, is largely due to, although they only have both have 1 season a year, Kaffrine has more land. Matopos has very little. Farmers in Matopos have very little. So they are unable, whatever the intensification, the movement along the x-axis, they're unable to intensify very much. And unfortunately, it gets a little bit more depressing, because if we go back to the original literature survey, where I looked at all of these different crops, different technologies in different countries, I'm able to pull out all of the values of net return for sorghum and millet. Now, sorghum and millet are crops that are characteristic of dry regions, as we know, semi-arid and arid regions. And the average, the mean net return with improved technologies for sorghum and millet is $176 per hectare per season. And that's the so that's there, and that's the sort of range. So at any of these sites, if you are forced to grow sorghum and millet, you can, in Makueni, you can only get 20-something% of your farmers above $1 a day. In Kaffrine, you can only get 10% of your farmers to $1 a day. In in Limuru and in Matopos, with sorghum and millet, you're not making any impact whatsoever. We also have able to calculate a mean value for maize with improved technologies from the literature analysis, and this is it, $300 per hectare per season. And in Makueni, okay, that gets you to 30% of the farmers above $1 a day. In Kaffrine, it gets you 17%. And again, in Matopos and Limuru, a couple of percent. There's also a calculation, a mean for the high value crops, which is up around the 520 mark, but none of these sites are able to grow these high value crops.
So just there, it means therefore that a place like Limuru and Matopos, even with high value crop, you are going nowhere.
Yep.
Because of land size.
Yes. Now, we're not even going to talk about risk, because we don't have any data on year-to-year variation in profitability. People do calculate risk in relation to yield variation, but the analysis of profitability variation is complicated because farmers, I would assume, would be responsive in different years and invest more or less depending on the circumstances. So variability in profitability is not the same as variability in production. So this is one of the things that I need to concentrate on to collect data on in that respect. Okay, we're nearing the end. The conclusions, as you can see, we've done very well in percentage terms by producing technologies. On average, our technologies from this literature survey increased profitability by 220%. And that's moving from a median of $84 per hectare per season to $268 per hectare per season. Very good in percentage terms. But there does seem to be a relatively narrow range of net returns per season, per hectare per season. And high returns are generally associated with plantation crops that occupy the land for 2 or 3 seasons. So from an agroforestry point of view, and a humid tropics point of view, and a plantation crops point of view, there's more scope, if you like, because simply with 2 seasons, you can double your net returns. 3 seasons, you can triple it. But for any given level of return, as I said, it depends on where you live. If you're lucky and live on or near the equator and you get 2 or 3 seasons a year, and you've got a reasonable farm size, then you can make some money. It's not rocket science, and it's not something that people haven't thought of before, but irrigation is the game changer here for rain-fed crops. Not just because it increases your choice of crops and allows you to choose crops of a higher value, so that takes you up the x-axis, but it also, and the main contribution of irrigation is it gives you extra seasons. So again, if you go from 1 to 2 seasons and a higher value crop, you're increasing your net returns quite dramatically. And if you can get 3 seasons with a high value crop, then you're starting to get good. The corollary of irrigation, of course, is that the costs increase too. And a cursory look at the literature suggests that the net returns from irrigated crops are not spectacularly higher than rain-fed crops because of this issue of increased costs and increased returns. So here are some implications, and I'm sure you can think of many more. With this limited range of profitability and the small farm sizes, absolute values of income, not percentage increases, but absolute values of income, even with the adoption of increased technology, are always going to remain small for most farmers, even if there's widespread adoption, which is what we mean by intensification. And intensification ability, to get back to the original title, depends not just on the agroecological characteristics of the site, the soils, the rainfall, etc., but also on household characteristics, primarily farm size. Some communities, it's counterintuitive, some communities that are in high potential areas, such as Limuru, very good soils, high rainfall, 2 seasons a year. They're never going to be able to intensify because their farms are too small. And this should be taken into account when we're looking for sites and we're targeting interventions. This is the most important one for me because my work is, I'm interested in looking at constraints to adoption and improving adoption of technologies. And this, for me, is the big thing. We should not assume that rural households are all full-time farmers, because with these levels of absolute values of income, they simply cannot be. And the evidence from the literature suggests that there are very, very few full-time smallholder farmers. And these small net returns, these should be taken into account when we go to households and say, adopt this technology, because other livelihood options may be more attractive, simply because the absolute values of returns from rain-fed cropping are very, very low. Now, I've given this presentation before, and these are common questions, so I'll save you some time by answering the questions before you ask them. The US dollar values in this analysis don't, at the moment, reflect purchasing power parity, which is a measure of the relative buying power between countries. I'm recalculating all the data at the moment, but on average, the net returns are likely to increase by, on average, around about 30% on the basis of purchasing power parity, which is good news. Unfortunately, the poverty threshold of $1 a day is very seldom used anymore. It's seen to be too low. So if you use the more commonly used one now, this 25% decrease cancels out this 30% increase. So the findings are pretty much the same in relative terms. There's always a huge debate between economists, and I'm not an economist, so I don't get involved, whether or not family labour needs to be costed in evaluating these technologies. From my point of view of ignorance, it's a no-brainer. If you don't include family labour, then you're ignoring opportunity costs, and opportunity costs for households that are not full-time farmers, as they cannot be, is a nonsense. So I've included labour and I've included family labour. As I said earlier, as far as I can tell, with that simple equation, all land-based enterprises fit the model. But this analysis is only for rain-fed crops, and I've not looked in any detail at livestock or non-timber forest products or timber or any of these other land-based enterprises that you would find on smallholder farms. Now, I don't know whether you can add them all up if they're all going on at the same time, or whether there are trade-offs. I suspect a bit of both. Some synergies, but some trade-offs. So what I will be doing at the next stage of this analysis is trying to look at some of these synergies and interactions. Thank you.
Well, good number. Thanks, Dave. Let's have questions and so on, and then I'll try to also ask questions afterwards. Anyway, can we have some questions, please? Sarah?
I'm just depressed. So I just wonder what's the way forward then. I mean, would it help bring farmers together or hand land over to a larger farmer, and then get the farmers to work as laborers there or something? I mean, what might be the way forward for this kind of situation?
It's a good question. If you have 10 households, each with a hectare, and you put it together into a 10-hectare farm, it's still supporting 10 households. So the equation still holds. There may be some economies of scale by farming 10 hectares, which would help a bit. But it's, I mean, this is a huge problem. I mean, if it was simple, people would have solved it before. The way it got solved in Europe and the US was people got off the land and you know, industrial revolution, and that was accompanied by huge amounts of pain and suffering and what have you. And development thinking over the last 50 years has been essentially focused on how not to do it that way. For many developing countries, the problem may be, an additional problem may be, that when the Industrial Revolution and the movement off the land happened in Europe and in the US, the populations were much smaller, and industrial opportunities to produce jobs, etc., were much greater. So it is the question, but I'm just the messenger. Sorry.
You know, I've been thinking about it. I've lived in Kenya. It's a common practice everywhere nowadays. Take central Kenya and western Kenya, where population is high. If you look in both places, you find that there are people coming to the cities. The small bit of it is that these people who are coming to the city are looking for employment, which are not there, but is a small, younger people with energy and so on, try to put back money into the thing to keep their parents and sometimes children there. The outcome of that is also that a number of people do not have jobs, and that is hard, crime in the city and so on, because we don't have alternative income generation thing. In Central, you find that a lot of people have also moved to the cities and so on. But then the main who remain there, you know, the issue of alcoholism and all these things, it ties. So the question is that what is it we should do? And as I said, the Industrial Revolution that took place 100 years ago. Was it 140? 1880 something. And we don't have the thing. It's not only here. You go to India, the cities and so on, like Mumbai and so on, you have a view and so on. So what is it?
I'm glad you mentioned India, because it's only a theory of mine, but it seems to me, and it links to one of the issues that I raised, which is irrigation. If you're talking about small farm size, India is the classic. There are something like 100 million farming households in India, and their average farm size is a hectare. Now, what India has done, it seems to me, is that over the last 50 years or so, they have developed irrigation. And I think something like over 45% of land in India now is irrigated. What that's allowed them to do is stave off the problem, postpone the problem, by allowing people with a hectare, on average, to have 2 and 3 seasons a year. And you plug that into the equation, and that keeps them viable. And it was like a holding operation until Indian GDP has picked up enough to generate industrialization on a huge scale to provide alternative opportunities. Just a theory, but it seems to me that that's what's happened. And ICRISAT has a beautiful set of data. They have these longitudinal village level studies from India that go back to 1970 something. And they've resurveyed the same villages at regular intervals. And the share of the share of household income from agriculture has gone from about 85–90% in the mid-70s down to 30% in the latest survey, in the same villages.
Well, thanks, Dave. I think, I really liked your presentation. It's exactly showing the case that we can see in Europe and the US and any other developed country where there is a very small portion of the population living off the land and the rest of the population living from services, industry, etc. And this is, of course, the development that will happen in India and in Africa at large over time. There is no doubt that this, let's say, development out of agriculture is the path for the future that allows higher profits, higher value commodities, better connection between, the connection between the land and then the markets, productivity increases, so we move the x-axis up, and at the same time, the demand for land to produce that output, that profit, reduces, and that's what makes it viable in the end. And then there's government subsidies in developed economies, and that's how these things work. And that's the way that it's going to go in Africa. The question I have is, why on earth is the CG and other development donors focusing until today on the premise that development should happen on the land? And that's a question I can't find an answer to. It's just like the elephant in the room, not wanting to see the problem.
Well, I certainly can't speak for the CG, and if I tried to, I'd get the sack. You're absolutely right. I mean, if you go on the USDA website, they have historical records for the profitability of a whole range of crops, one of which is, for instance, rainfed sorghum. And it's about the same as the profitability of sorghum here. Call it $200, $300 per hectare. So this guy in the Midwest in the US is growing rainfed sorghum, and he's only getting $300 a hectare. But he's got 1,000 hectares, and that's fantastic business. That's $300,000 profit a year. And that's ignoring, and that $300 is ignoring subsidies and things. If you've got 1,000 hectares and you grow rainfed sorghum in the US, if you've got 1,000 hectares in Kenya and grow rainfed sorghum, you make a fortune. If you've only got 1 hectare or half a hectare, you're stuffed. You're always going to be stuffed. So this has come to me relatively recently, and I've spent my long career, as Saeed said, producing technologies, and then wondering why farmers don't adopt them. Well, I think there's a large amount in here that explains why farmers tend not to adopt, particularly technologies that require extra investment. Mary's lucky because she produces new varieties, and if farmers grow sorghum, then it doesn't take much to grow better sorghum if you can give them a good variety. I'm not saying that because that's a commodity-based organisation. That's a fact. If you're trying to get farmers to put in bunding or do something complicated, this explains why they're not adopting it. It's not worth the bother.
In the restructuring of the CDR, there's a number of CDR research programs that look at agricultural systems, particularly CRP 1.1 and CRP 1.2. I'm a relative newcomer in the CDR, and I was just amazed to see that there was a fierce struggle about where do we have systems where there's possibility for intensification, and where do we have systems where there's no possibility for intensification. And the approach which has been taken is as a sole indicator using a aridity index, so everything having less than so many days per year a water surplus were considered areas at risk, so non-intensification addresses this. When following your argument, you would say, well, hold on, just looking at it from a livelihood perspective and possibility to get out of poverty through agriculture, you would need to consider this landholder. So would it be possible, because you were just mentioning now the situation for a number of specific cases, to redo the exercise and just map out the areas where we see intensifications still make sense and where it doesn't? I think we do a great service to do that, to get away from the illusion this is there.
Well, I work predominantly on CRP 1.1. So I have raised this issue at various planning meetings, and the response is generally the same, and then ignoring it is generally the same too. So CRP 1.1 and 1.2, which it also applies, are both resubmitting revised proposals this year. And I was hoping that this would be taken into account, but I'm having difficulties, shall we say, in getting this included. Those 20 sites that I found, they're included because I could find them. They weren't included, they weren't chosen systematically. But it seems to me that on the biophysical, agro-biophysical grounds that you mentioned that are being used to choose intensification sites, almost all of them, maybe certainly 16 of those sites are intensification sites. And as you can see, very, very few of them, if any, depends on your definition, but very few of them are what you would really call intensification sites in terms of household impact. In terms of, you know, soils and rainfall, you can increase in percentage terms, as I said, by large amounts, because we've all been very, very efficient and effective in producing good technologies. And if farmers adopt them, the increase in percentage terms will be big. But 150% of hardly anything is still hardly anything. So I don't know where to go. I've tried to raise the profile of this issue in these planning meetings, and people are not stupid. They recognise the implications, and then they do what they were going to do anyway.
Come to CRP7.
I gave this presentation at CRP7, but it was in a small room with half the people here, and you know, it doesn't go anywhere.
Yes, yeah, man.
Okay. Thank you
Can
very
you
much.
be loud, man? And this is for people at the back. Be loud.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a eye-opening presentation, especially for me working in Sorghum. You mentioned Makweni as one of your sites. You indicated the net returns for maize to be about 500.
No. I have no data for any of these sites on what the actual returns are. The analysis logic is I've been to the literature and calculated average values. Okay, and then applied those to try we're using that equation to work out what would happen in Makweni if they grew maize and got that net return from maize. I'm not saying that the net return in Makweni isn't higher than that, but I'm certain it's no more than $700 per hectare.
Yeah, the point I'm trying, or the message I'm trying to get is a place like Makweni, which we know is dry, and it seems like maize would be a more profitable crop than sorghum.
For intensification.
Yes, I don't know. He will explain to me that I have a correct understanding of that. And also, I really want to get to understand what are the intensification sites, because according to what we know is that places with small land holdings but favorable environment, you can
put more investments that we can be able to anything. But it seems like from your analysis, that's not the case. So what are the criteria for the intensification side?
If you define intensification as increasing yields or increasing profitability, you can intensify anywhere. But if what that means is that you've increased income, agricultural income, from $50 per hectare to $51 per hectare, technically that's intensification. In practical terms, that extra dollar is unlikely to be worth the volume. Even in Kenya, for instance, if I remember correctly, the proportion of the average proportion of agricultural income for smallholders is about 50%. There aren't many full-time smallholder farmers in Kenya, and at these levels of income for small farms, there can't be. You can't live on $80 a year, $200, $300 a year. You can't do it. You've got to sell something or work on somebody else's farm, or your brother-in-law drives a taxi in Nairobi. Small farms are not viable. They're not viable in the UK, for instance. Anybody with 50 hectares in the UK cannot live on farming. Their wife goes out to work, they run bed and breakfast, they sell this, they have a shop. The small farm problem is a huge problem everywhere. It's just the scale is slightly different in relative terms. In 50 hectares in Kenya, fantastic. 50 hectares in the UK, you've got to do all sorts of other things. It's the same in Europe.
Let's see if there's somebody, then we'll come back to you.
Okay, probably a bit of a naive question, but yeah, you had this hypothesis of this long-term demographic shift with industrialization, and that's great, but as Kind said in very different contexts, in the long run, we're all dead. So what can we do in terms of target interventions in the near term? I mean, obviously, I'm not trying to ask for an exhaustive set of strategies, but I mean, obviously, I think you would agree that then this is going to have to be a research priority. Can you just gesture towards anything that you think would be more helpful in terms, I know you said diversification from on-farm income, but anything more concretely after that, or?
From an agricultural research point of view, I started off with this general consensus that the two objectives are, for agricultural intensification, are poverty reduction, food security. Poverty reduction, waste of time. Food security, absolutely. So, for me, we should all be working on food security, because that's the only place we're going to make any impact. We are never going to make any impact for the majority of small farms on poverty reduction. But the real thing for me is that why I like this analysis is about adoption. You can't get intensification without adoption anyway. So unless you understand all the constraints to adoption, and this seems to me to be a big constraint, you're never going to get intensification anyway, because people won't adopt these things. We've got a terrible record on adoption. We've been at it for forever.
I think that what is logical follow-up of what you're finding over here is to get the story out. Just to say, it's intensifying in the rural areas. We need the policy level to make the European basis. We need to get 10 or 20 million people out of agriculture in the next 5 or 10 or 20 years. Yeah? That will open space to get viable farming enterprises. I don't think that story is out there. I think you have the information to start working on that.
You have two things there. You either create what we call IDP, so that the 20 million go to there, because internally displaced people where you can feed them and so on, because there are no jobs to take these people. You see what I mean? Unless there is industrialization, that's one. For the younger people, fewer children, so that we don't have population going up. Okay, that's another one. And eventually, the cultural setup, because for an African, land is life, you should own it. That means also the mindset and the government, policies and so on. Without that, I don't know.
The Davis was spending 1 sentence on that. Davis was spending 1 sentence on the cultural attachment of people in Europe and the US to the island, and he used the word pain, terrible pain. So it was not an easy process. Just getting the people out of the land. It was a very painful process. But these societies have been going through that, and there have been government policies really to make sure that it is happening. I don't think it is at the radar of policymakers and all the of the world that this is the way out. And if we as the CG don't put it on the agenda, who else is doing it?
I mean, the Kenyan landlord tried to play with the issue of consolidating land. I don't know whether the land policy ever touched it again, because it became a very emotive issue. So that one has been because there's no alternative. Yeah. At the moment, there is movement. If you look at it, a lot of people. Nairobi was built for few people. Now it's got about so many million. We sit here in this good area and so on. We have about a quarter acre, half acre. But there are people sitting on each other in places like Kibera and so on because of that movement and the impact you can see. Unless there is some way out through industrialization and all these things, then you have to multiply it. Otherwise, everybody will still own the whole land, and the land becomes. I mean, in Western Kenya, in Nyanza, in Central, people put the total number of people, and so the average of land holding is less than an acre. And that's really, I don't know, they know it, everybody knows it. Just like you said, it is an elephant in the room. Too hot and yes, please.
Yeah, thanks, David. Now, looking at what you've been it really brings another picture in most of the households that we are working with. Now, there's a project involved in Italy, which we are working on actually a half an acre. Half an acre is now very small compared to the 2 about. But under that half an acre, we have a project with chili, Lundgren chili, passion fruit, and angry flowers. But in the same setting for the household, because we are working on from what exists, you're giving us an impression from what has worked elsewhere, which is good. But looking at what is already ongoing, these people have been living there and they have not died. If you go by the statistics you're giving, they're supposed to have died a long time ago. But I know there are subsidies from us who are working with saving money and all that. Now, from that half an acre, for Lundgren chili, particularly, they're able to raise about 72,000 shillings per half a year. So they can make it about 100 per year. Now, if you look at, I'm just doing my calculation here, you can get about $5 per day if you divide that income by the 365 days in a year. Besides that, they are also diversified. They have poultry, and poultry, if they have a number of birds, can give them this and so on. They are living. They are able to raise that above that $1 for a household of about 6. And I think that's the apple that we could actually focus on. And what Sarah asked, if you pull these people together, it's not just divided by the people, but you're organizing the marketing, because marketing is very critical. Even if they raise that yield and the marketing is so distorted, they're not able to get better prices. That still goes to waste. But if marketing is organized, they can actually get a benefit from the pooled resources. So I think we need to work on the organization of these farmers if there's no land. It might not be that they are still the little what they have from the table, but it could actually put it together.
Okay, no, good point. Can I ask if it's irrigated?
It's actually open. Some are doing it like for the chili under irrigation, because having as low as quarter an acre, so those can afford to irrigate. But they're really depending. The peak season is it coincides with the rainy season. The peak harvest, that is.
Because irrigation confuses the issue. I mean, irrigation is the game changer. You can do well on small pieces of land with irrigation. That's not contentious at all. So if irrigation's involved, then I have nothing to say in relation to this analysis.
And diversification.
Sorry?
Diversification, because you have like poultry, which gives it sometimes much more than even what Chile is giving.
Yeah, yeah. But livestock is a very complicated issue, because livestock ultimately is a land-based activity. Even if it's not on the bit of land that you're actually on, even if you buy feed in, that is per unit area of somebody else's land. So we need to do this analysis for livestock. Then we need to do this analysis for livestock plus crops plus, etc., etc., etc. And as I said, my very last point was that we simply don't know what influence synergies have and interactions between these various enterprises have. But marketing is included in this analysis because the net returns include the prevailing market rates in most of these studies that came from the literature review. So this is the best case. These net returns are the best case, including improved marketing. So,
I think I'm going to stop here before I stop, because I know if I keep you longer, you miss your tea next week when you come. So, can I suggest that probably that data you're talking about can be you discuss with him so that you put it, otherwise he's going to present the same data again somewhere else.
Sure.
So it should be improved on issues and so on. I mean, I would like to thank you all for coming, and please, next time you hear that there's a seminar, don't think that it's an aircraft seminar per se, but it's campus seminar, so that we brainstorm, we cross-coordinate. Thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you.
I'll come and see you some other time. Yeah. There's a lot to do. Well, there's a lot. This is a fantastic thing to start off with, but it needs
it gets into the literature review and then it gets concluded.
Oh, publish. Publish. Yeah. Well, it's still I call it on a kind of basis. So much work has been done. Yeah. So maybe the rest of the time we need to have it published. Yeah. So it really works. And the money you're bringing is good, but it's not practical in most.
You said, these people haven't died. Yeah. Well, no, they haven't, and it's because they're adding their agricultural income to income from elsewhere.
Yeah.
Can you get this presentation? These guys are still discussing. Do you have it here?
This was just great.
Pardon?
No, the marketing we're talking about.
Oh, you forward it.
Yeah.
You can also forward it to me.
The values I use in the analysis are the values that the original researchers used in their publications, but most of them are using prevailing market rates.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, because in the pool system, as I was talking about, the benefit of having the best market, not just the prevailing.